So my wife and I were out west for the first time a couple of months ago. I had never been out west. She had been there before. But we were in Phoenix, Arizona. And we were about a 4-hour drive from the Grand Canyon. But I told my wife, Bailey, I said, we're only a 4-hour drive from the Grand Canyon, which is a whole lot closer than the 24-hour drive that we have here from Florence. So why don't we get a rental car? Why don't we go up on our free day? And so we did. So we take off in a rental car one morning, and I'm excited. I've always wanted to go to the Grand Canyon. It's always been on my bucket list. And so all of these different questions start entering my mind. And so I'm in the front seat driving, and my wife is in the passenger seat, and she's just kind of staring out the windows, like you do, just taking in all the scenery. And so I'm thinking out loud, and I ask, how big really is the Grand Canyon? I'm not really asking her the question. I'm just talking out loud. And so she's over here just not missing a beat, and she says, well, it's a mile deep, it's 17 miles wide, and it's 277 miles long. I said, no, really, Google it, get out your phone, and let's see how big the Grand Canyon really is. And so she says, okay, I'll Google it. And she has that little smirk on her face. You know that smirk when you see it. And so she Googled it, and she showed me the phone, and she said, it's 1 mile deep, 17 miles wide, and 277 miles long. I said, Bailey, how in the world did you know how big the Grand Canyon was? And she said something, and it stuck with me, and I'll never forget it. She said, Austen, I'm full of information, but most of it's useless. Well, it's useless unless you're playing trivia with her, but she said, most of it's useless. And that got me thinking about the concept of what matters. I want you to think about your everyday walk of life. At school, at home, at work, wherever you may be. Let's take school, for example. You're presented with countless information every single day. And what are you expected to do? Well, you're expected to learn and to know the material that your teachers present you. Why is that the case? Because you're going to be tested on it. And if you don't know the information, if you don't learn the information, then you're not going to do well on the test. And so that's the immediate result of that. Let's think a little bit more long term. For those of you who are sophomores, juniors, seniors in high school, maybe you've taken the ACT before. And you know that a lot of the information on the ACT is stuff that you were supposed to have learned previously in high school. And so if you don't learn that information, if you don't know the information, then you might not be as successful in school. You may not be as successful in the ACT, which may prevent you from getting to the college you want to in the career that you've always dreamed of. Think about it from a business perspective. I work in the business world every single day. And when customers call me with questions, they expect me to know the answers. What you know is important. And from an earthly perspective, from just living life here on this earth, it's very clear that knowledge is important. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 15 says, an intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. Later on in Proverbs chapter 24 and verse 5, there we read that the Bible says that a wise man is full of strength, and a man of knowledge enhances his might. From an earthly perspective, what you know matters. Let's think about it from a spiritual perspective for a few minutes. What you know as a Christian matters. When I was working with a youth group up in Nashville, Tennessee at the Mount Juliet congregation, the preacher there was David Shannon, and he has since transitioned into the role as the president of Freed Hardeman. But he always told this story. He always had this illustration that really hit home with me when it comes to this aspect of knowing as a Christian. I want you to imagine with me for just a second that I'm going on vacation. I'm going to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. You may have been to Gatlinburg before, perhaps for CYC, perhaps for a family vacation, but I want you to imagine with me for just a second that you've never been to Gatlinburg. And I've never been to Gatlinburg. And so I seek out people to try to help me. And so I put out on Facebook, I put out on Instagram, social media, that, hey, I'm taking this trip to Gatlinburg. I've never been. could somebody help me with directions? And so I get a phone call. He said, the person on the other line says, hey, man, I hear you're going to Gatlinburg. And I say, yes, I'm super excited. I said, could you tell me how to go? I've never been there. I'm not familiar with the roads. I have no idea how to get there. And so he tells me how to get there. And I say, hey, well, while I've got you on the line, could you tell me a few restaurants that you'd recommend while I'm there? And he said, well, I've never been to Gatlinburg. And I say, well, hold on just a second. If you've never been to Gatlinburg, how do you know how to get there? And he says, well, my parents and grandparents grew up going to Gatlinburg, and so I know that they would know how to get there, and I've just learned from them. I say, okay, well, I appreciate your time. Thank you. So I hang up the phone. The phone rings again. Hey, man, I hear you're going to Gatlinburg. And I say, yeah, I'm super excited. Could you help me with directions? And so this individual, they give me directions to Gatlinburg. I say, hey, well, I've got you on the line. Could you tell me, is Dollywood worth going to? And they say, well, if I'm being honest with you, I've never been to Gatlinburg. And I say, well, if you've never been to Gatlinburg, how did you know how to get there? And the individual said, well, my preacher's always told me how to get to Gatlinburg, and I know that my preacher would know how to get there, and he certainly wouldn't lie to me. And I say, well, thank you for the directions. I appreciate it. And at this point, I'm kind of getting frustrated. The phone rings one more time. And I say, but before you waste your time, could you please just tell me this? Have you ever been to Gatlinburg? And the person says, no, I've never been, but I promise you, I've got this really good feeling that I know how to get there. And so I say, well, I appreciate your time, and I hung up the phone. At this point, I'm throwing my hands up. I'm thinking, you know what? There is no way I'm going to Gatlinburg. I'm discouraged. Nobody can give me the right directions. And the phone rings one more time. And I pick up the phone and I say, you know what? I appreciate you calling, but I'm no longer interested in Gatlinburg. Nobody I talk to can tell me how to get there. No information about it. Nothing. And the voice on the other line says, you know, well, not only have I been to Gatlinburg, but I built Gatlinburg. And I created the way there. I want you to think about that from a spiritual perspective for just a moment. When we think about those first three examples, when we think about the family, when we think about the preacher, when we think about that feeling that we have, how many people do you know in your life, and maybe you've been there before, that rely on other people for their spiritual knowledge? I mean, I want you to think about all of the voices that you hear every single day. You've got school, you've got teachers, you've got friends, you've got family, you've got religious leaders, you've got social media, you've got all of these different avenues of voices that you hear every single day. And when we think about that, those voices, well, here's a question you may ask. Well, Austen, can't those voices lead us to the truth? And the answer to that is absolutely. But on the other end of that spectrum, can those voices, can those teachers, can those friends, can your family, can that religious leader, can all of these influences keep you from knowing the truth? And the answer to that is absolutely. Because when I think about those first three examples, I think about passages like 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 3, where Paul there tells Timothy that there is coming a time when people will not endure sound teaching, but with itching ears they will accumulate for themselves teachers who suit their own passions and turn away from listening to the truth. And in Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, there the Bible says that it is not in man's own way to direct his own steps. And when I step back and I think about it, God never intended for us to rely on other sources. Because here's the bottom line. What you know matters, but the source is all that matters. In John chapter 14 and verse 6, there Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. In John chapter 8 and verse 31 and 32, there Jesus says, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. In John chapter 17 and verse 17, there Jesus says, sanctify them in your truth. Your word is truth. Did you pick up on a few phrases that we read several times in those passages? Truth and word. At the end of the day, when we think about all of these different voices that we hear, if their source isn't the Bible, if their source, if their truth isn't the Word that Jesus talks about in the book of John, then we're in the same boat as my wife said in that rental car on the way to the Grand Canyon. The things that we know from a spiritual perspective are useless. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus has a conversation with His disciples. And in verse 13, the Bible says, now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, He asked His disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And so Jesus asked them a simple question. Who do other people say that I am? And notice their response. And they said, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And so you can imagine, I want you to imagine that you were there that day and you hear this conversation between Jesus and His disciples. And He asks them the question, who do others say that I am? And what is their response? Well, some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist or Jeremiah, one of the prophets. So Jesus asks them a question and they tell Him what others said. Was their answer good enough? Verse 15, He said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him in verse 17, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Notice that phrase. But flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Because at the end of the day, and at the end of our life, when we stand before God to give an account of the things that we've done, you see, it isn't going to be about, well, that's what my preacher always told me, or, that's what my parents always told me. It's not about what others say. Because we're not going to be judged. Our eternal destination is not going to be based on what other people have told us. But just as Jesus says in verse 17, but my Father who is in heaven. You see, because at the end of our life, we're not going to give an account for the things that other people have told us, but only the true source. And so when you think about your life as a Christian, and here's the challenge that I want to leave with you right now, and the challenge that I have for myself, is to understand that what you know matters, but the source is all that matters.